Good morning. Welcome to the Forest Practices Board's question and answer webinar in follow-up to our June 23rd, 2020 presentation of protection of fish habitat under the Forest and Range Practices Act. My name is Sky. I'll be moderating today's event. I'm the Executive Operations Coordinator for the Forest Practices Board. I'm hosting this webinar from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. As a guest, I recognize the importance of their historic relationship with the land that continues to this day. In a moment, I'll introduce you to our panelists. In the June 23rd webinar, we launched a thought exchange for participants to pose questions of the panel and rank the questions of their fellow attendees. We were able to address several of those questions at the end of that webinar, with many more questions remaining to be addressed. During the first 15 to 20 minutes of today's event, our panelists will answer the highest ranked of those questions. I've also set up another thought exchange for participants to pose further questions, and we've reserved some time toward the end of today's event to address those questions as well. You can access that exchange through the QR code displayed to the side here, or by entering the displayed web address, tejoin.com, into your browser and entering the 9-digit ID when prompted to get the same exchange. Once there, you'll see our conversation prompt asking you to pose your questions. Your questions remain anonymous, as do your rankings of others' questions. When you're done entering your questions, you'll be given the opportunity to rate the questions of your fellow attendees on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. Doing this will help me direct our panelists to those questions of greatest importance to you. You may choose to keep it open during the presentation so that you can continue to pose questions and rate the questions posed by others. I'll display this QR code and web address again during today's presentation. Attendees, you've all entered this webinar in listen-only mode. This means that you are muted and the speakers cannot hear you. Your presenters today are Doug Wall, a professional biologist with the Forest Practices Board. He is working on the territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation at Summerland. And Derek Tripp, professional biologist with Tripp & Associates Consulting. Derek is broadcasting from the territory of the Comox First Nation at Courtenay. Others that worked on the Fish Habitat Protection Project are Hannah Horn, a professional biologist, now heading the Cumulative Effects and Monitoring Program for the Ministry of Forests, Lands and Natural Resource Operations. Rob Shear, professional engineer and professional hydrologist, and Sean Hamilton, professional biologist and fish habitat specialist. Welcome, Doug and Derek.
Morning.
Doug, would you like to give us some background on the reports that led to this discussion today?
Okay, so back in July of 2018, the board published its special report on conserving fish habitat under FRPA, and that really launched the two-part report or two-part project on protection of fish habitat. Now in part one, our focus was on the governance pieces. How well is government providing for the protection of fish habitat on the forest and range land base? Also, as part of that special report, we interviewed a number of government specialists and consulting specialists, as well as agency staff, to really try and identify some of the key concerns they had about protection of fish habitat on the ground. In part two, which is a special investigation that we're talking about today, we went on the ground in 5 watersheds that we selected with the help of key government staff and consulting fish habitat specialists to really see to what extent do those issues exist on the ground.
Thanks very much, Doug. Now on to our questions. Doug, I'm going to pose our first question to you. Has the report initiated any practice changes in the subject watersheds?
Okay, good question. So we went to, as I mentioned before, we went to 5 watersheds around the province, and in each of those watersheds, we always, after or during our work, we invited licensees and ranchers to attend our work with us. And in one of those watersheds, that's the Wood Jam, part of the larger Horsefly River watershed, we did identify a significant area of stream on the main stem of Wood Jam, which had been impacted by long-standing or heavy livestock use. And in that case, we contacted range branch and district range staff, and that area was completely fenced off. I'm not sure about what actions have been undertaken since the report's been published in any of those other watersheds.
Thanks, Doug. Derek, could you discuss the sampling method? In quotes, investigators visually observed that sediment was entering streams. It's important to clarify how sampling was carried out.
Sure. When we did see sediment entering a stream, of course, we took note of that. But our main approach to assessing the risk of sediment delivery to a stream was to use the FRPA Water Quality Effectiveness Evaluation Protocol. That gave us a pretty consistent, repeatable methodology to use at each stream crossing. The methodology is widely available. It's fairly straightforward. We looked at mini catchments going into each stream crossing, and we estimated the volume of sediment that would enter the stream on an annual basis. And this was primarily fine sediment we're talking about. So we looked at catchment area, we looked at the type of material, what kind of road use it was. Was it a heavy use road or a light use road? And we looked at the degree of connectivity. And with those basic metrics, we were able to come up with a volume estimate of fine sediment that would enter the stream on an annual basis. And those are the data that we sort of based our risk ratings on.
Thanks, Derek. Doug, should licensees be responsible for monitoring stream crossings, even on deactivated roads for an extended period of time, for example, until free growing?
Okay, so currently under FRPA, or the FRPA model, the Forest and Range Evaluation Program is responsible for conducting monitoring, including water quality effectiveness evaluations, as Derek had talked about. I think it's absolutely imperative that we're always monitoring our practices as part of the continuous improvement philosophy. So we have a set of requirements, we monitor the effectiveness of those requirements, identify improvements that need to be made, we implement those improvements, and then continue on. I can't really comment on whether or not government should require licensees to monitor, except that I think it's imperative that we are monitoring our forest and range practices.
Thanks very much.
Can I add a comment there? I noticed it asks about deactivated roads, and I think all road types should be included in a monitoring program, just so you've got adequate coverage of all the different road types. Now, deactivated roads normally don't pose a problem in terms of fine sediment delivery to streams, but occasionally there can be sometimes catastrophic introduction of sediments, not just fines, but also coarse sediments at abandoned roads or deactivated roads. So it's important to include them in any kind of a monitoring program.
Thank you, Derek. Derek, my next question is for you. Was there any thought to examining changes to flow or hydrological regimes due to logging in a watershed? Flow regimes are critical for fish habitat.
We did want to actually, sort of look at that aspect of this study, looking at flow hydrological regimes. That's what ECA is, or equivalent clear-cut area. We saw it's a crucial metric in sort of determining the rate of cut in a lot of those watersheds, or at least I think 3 or 4 of the 5 watersheds we looked at. But we weren't convinced that that was actually all that good a metric. Firstly, it didn't really capture the low flow regime, which we thought was probably more important than even changes to maybe the average peak flow regime. So, but the data out there, we weren't really sure we had good metrics or good information to relate harvest practices to say extended low flow periods or low flow periods that are now could become longer than normal and perhaps lower as well.
Thank you, Derek. Doug, I'm going to pose this one to you. It says, interesting. Your fish passage findings don't concur with the findings of the assessment work done by the Fish Passage Technical Working Group.
Okay, so when the Forest and Range Practices Act was enacted in 2004 and came into full effect in 2006, there is a requirement in the Forest Planning and Practices Regulation that all stream crossing structures installed after 1995, I think it was July of 1995, must be passable to fish. So in this investigation, we looked at that subset of culverts installed after 1995, and we didn't find any significant problems. That's not to say that in those watersheds there aren't fish passage problems, but they would most likely be related to culvert structures installed prior to 1995, which we did not look at.
Yeah, could I add to that?
Go ahead.
I think of a couple other reasons why our findings didn't agree. And by the way, I think that provincial stream crossing inventory system is just an absolutely fabulous database. They've got tens of thousands of crossings summarized on it. They'll tell you not only whether the crossing is passable or possibly a barrier or a complete barrier. They actually show you how much habitat is isolated by the crossing in terms of gradient class. We focused primarily on high and moderate value fish habitat. So that's habitat basically 0 to 15% habitat, and didn't look as much at the kind of lower value habitat. And that habitat, when we looked at 0 to 15, we also really only considered a significant problem if we saw a blockage. If there was a significant amount of habitat upstream, and if it was only 100 meters, we really didn't consider it. And the other thing is, critical thing is, we focused on known fish-bearing streams and not a GIS-based gradient model, which sometimes maybe exaggerates fish distribution in a watershed. One particular watershed we looked at was the Memeki. It had previously been identified as having fish passage problems. When we went out and kind of truthed those sites, we found they were in non-fish bearing habitat, and we felt confident on that because the Memeki watershed had also been the subject of a fairly detailed reconnaissance survey, which showed that the distribution of fish in that watershed was actually much more restricted than the GIS-based gradient model used by the Fish Passage Technical Committee. So those things kind of conspired to probably reduce the number of problems that we would see, and also the fact that we're just dealing with a much smaller population, so understandably our results might be quite different. Thanks.
Thank you, Derek. I'm just going to take a brief pause here to remind participants of our ongoing thought exchange. This is the method that we are using to gather even more questions from our audience now for our panelists to address. Your questions will remain anonymous, as do your rankings of others' questions. For those that arrived late and missed my earlier instructions, if you have a smart device at home, just open the camera and focus on that QR code, and you'll be taken directly to the exchange. Alternately, you can type the web address displayed, tejoin.com, into your browser and enter the 9-digit code when prompted. If we get further along in this presentation and you want to be reminded of that, just take a look down in the chat section there of your GoToWebinar box, and my co-moderator Darlene has entered in that tejoin.com and that PIN number for you to refer to. You may want to keep that open during the remainder of the presentation so that you can continue to pose questions and rate the questions of others. I'm going to return to our questions. My next question is for Derek. Can you expand on the reasoning why equivalent clear-cut area would not impact fish habitat? The link between ECA and hydrological integrity seems pretty well established and appears to be the cause of cumulative effects like sediment.
Well, ECA, or equivalent clear-cut area. Now, I'm a fish biologist, so I'm giving you a perspective of a fish biologist, not a hydrologist. In its most basic terms, it's a measure of how much snow and rain actually lands on the ground. So the opposite of what would be captured by trees. And if you have snow and rain landing on trees, you have a loss of precipitation or water through transpiration and evaporation, sublimation if it's snow. You know, I'm not totally convinced there is that good a link between ECA and hydrological performance in a watershed. And I'm not really sure that you can then extend that to another metric like the cumulative effects of fine sediment delivery to a stream. ECA has been used for a long time. It's a very convenient metric. I think it's been, ever since FRPA has been in every forest stewardship plan, it seems to be, I see ECA as the metric determining, you know, what the rate of cut is going to be, or factors like that. But when you actually look at ECA and the other metrics like, you know, maybe fish abundance or fish habitat quality, there is not much of a relationship at all. Eric Valdau and his supervisor, Dr. Quinn, did a study on a lot of these common metrics used in watershed assessments and compared them to fish habitat and fish numbers. And ECA just was absolutely the worst metric for its predictive ability. Things like the length of streams logged to the stream edge, or especially length of non-fish streams logged to the stream edge, were much better predictors of the cumulative effects, or you know, fish numbers, fish habitat quality. So you know, I question the use of and usefulness of ECA as a metric to, you know, protect fish habitat.
I'll comment on, just to add to that, I think ECA is an indicator, but needs to be coupled with a number of other indicators around the, you know, hydrological integrity and how it relates to protection of fish habitat in the watershed.
Yeah, good point.
Thanks very much. I'm going to address my next question to Doug. What range of distances can sedimentation affect fish habitat below its entry point into the stream?
That's a really good question, and there's a wide body of published literature on the subject of the impact of sediment on fish and fish habitat. And it really boils down to two elements. One is the concentration, so how much sediment is in the water, and the duration. How long is that sediment in the actual water column before it settles out of suspension? So a really fine fraction sediment like clay, for example, clay is difficult to erode, but once it is in suspension, it can travel very long distances, and in some cases, it will not fall out of suspension until it might reach a large body of water. An example on a project I was involved in quite a few years ago, during road construction, they intercepted a major clay seam, and within a week had a major 1 in 100 year rainfall event. That sediment, or that clay seam, largely a fair bit of that eroded into a very high value fish stream supporting dolly varden and bull trout. And I tracked that sediment completely across the stream channel width for at least 15 kilometers downstream in a amount of concentration that most certainly would have been lethal to eggs in the gravel, which occurred at that time of deposition. So the coarser sediment fraction, sand, for example, is highly erodible, but once it enters the stream, it's not likely to be carried down the stream too far. So it's the duration of sediment in the stream and the concentration, the actual amount.
Thanks very much, Doug. We've had quite a few good questions posed in our thought exchange. I'm going to transfer us over to some of those questions now. The first one I'm going to pose to you, either of you. What would the authors of the report suggest as changes to legislation to address sedimentation from roads?
I think I'll take a stab at this. So there's quite a few different approaches. So in the Fisheries Act, which has undergone quite a few different changes, but one of the sections around the deposit of a deleterious substance has not changed at all through the last 10 years. So that sets a threshold that you cannot deposit any amount of deleterious substance into fish habitat. So there's that. There's models where there's a threshold set. For example, in some fishery-sensitive watershed orders, the current generation, like the horsefly watershed, fisheries-sensitive watershed order, it sets a threshold of a low. That low is the same as a low as determined in the FREP water quality effectiveness evaluation protocol. There's other options where you could set the concentration limit, so a TSS or total suspended sediments or solids in the water column, and you would measure that. And then more in line with the FRPA model, where it sets an expected result, and coupled with that result, there's often a requirement of practice requirements to have a must ensure element, which is really about what did you do to prevent that non-compliance from occurring. So there's a potential where we could have something like you must ensure that you minimize sediment into a stream or a lake or into fish habitat or whatever, something like that. So it's the must ensure element coupled with what the expected result is another option. I think is mostly aligned with the other practice requirements in FRPA. I will say that the board in its recommendation, it doesn't prescribe the approach that should be taken. So we set in our recommendations for this investigation were around guidance and training as one recommendation. And the second recommendation was that we felt that sediment from roads into streams needs to be regulated. We have some ideas on how that could be done, but we don't prescribe that to government.
Thanks very much, Doug. A question that seems quite related. What changes to field practices would the authors recommend?
Do you want me to take a stab at that?
Go ahead, Derek.
I recall reading a master's thesis from 1953, and this fellow was looking at road construction and the impacts of that road construction on stream habitat. And his pictures that he literally pasted by hand with Scotch tape into his master's thesis look like any picture you could see today. And his recommendations are foundational, if you want to put it that way, because these recommendations have been carried forward in every best management practice I've ever seen on reducing sedimentation, controlling managing sedimentation, or planning for sedimentation on long roads and specifically at road crossings. So a lot of these these are best management practices that are well known. So I wouldn't want to single out any one single field practice because it is a fairly complex subject. But certainly lots of vegetative cover is important. So trying to establish and maintain lots of vegetative cover on approaches to stream crossings, elevating the crossing so that it's higher than the approaches can have quite a significant effect on reducing sediment delivery to the stream. And then hand in hand with that, just basic, water management on the road surface, either insloping or outsloping the road, crowning it. Combine that with, ditch blocks, water bars on the road. Even a swale, a long swale, which doesn't have to be a sharp, bump in the road, so that full logging trucks can successfully manage it. They can be tremendously effective. So those are just some of the field practices that I would recommend. Berm management, it's amazing. We saw one stream where there was continuous berm along many, many kilometers of road. And it only broke out by accident at stream crossings, where we thought, well, why didn't they just break that berm at strategic locations so that the sediment-laden water could just spill out onto the vegetation? So it's a complex, subject, but there's lots of information out there as to what can be done to minimize sediment delivery to streams.
Thanks,
Doug?
Derek.
Well, I think you've got it. The board in its commentary, which I encourage you all to read, it really talks about instilling a culture, or the need or the importance of a culture of good sediment management. And I think that Derek's talked about some of those pieces, and I think it's important to recognize that, first of all, that new culture is really quite important. We're seeing that culture in good riparian management adjacent to fish streams, and we're seeing that good culture around maintenance of protection of fish passage on culvert structures installed after 1995. And this is going to take quite a bit of time, combined with really good training program and practices enshrined in legislation, but it is going to take time. And I think it's valuable. I was speaking to a stewardship forester just yesterday about trying to tackle this in pieces. And I said, just imagine, if you did one thing and you could start that tomorrow in terms of your standard operating procedures, and that you're regularly cleaning bridge decks. It's a small piece of the many things that are required for good sediment management, but it is one piece that is quite easy to implement.
Thanks, Doug. And speaking of culture, our next highest rating here is BC has fallen behind other jurisdictions, Alberta and US, in fine sediment management at roads. Is FLNR interested in adopting such innovations? Leadership is required to change the existing culture.
I can't really speak to, all I can say is I'm sure that Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resource Operations is quite interested and concerned about the board's findings. We do know that, we have spoken to senior FLNRO staff after this investigation report was published. They're quite interested in engaging with the board about what we found in those watersheds and how some of the problems can be, or the issues identified can be resolved. I can't comment on whether or not BC has fallen behind. I don't know much about sediment management in Alberta or other US jurisdictions.
Thanks, Doug. One last question for us today. How will the board ensure its recommendations are being followed by licensees and government in these watersheds? The board has identified a pervasive issue, and the public needs confidence that the issue will be addressed.
So I'd encourage readers to go to our website, and we've just published the summer newsletter, and in that newsletter you can see an article about how the board deals with or follows up on recommendations it makes after our reports are published. And really the same applies in this investigation and the recommendations. Is we, after the reports are published and we make those recommendations, typically what happens is that we engage with senior government staff on approaches to implementing the recommendations, basically as providing commentary or opinion. Again, we don't prescribe the approaches that should be taken to address them, but I can assure you, or the person that asked this question, that we certainly follow up on responses that we receive from government on those recommendations. And if we feel that those recommendations or the responses to the recommendations aren't adequate, we certainly do, again, follow up with government on that. And I guess the person that asked this question is quite right. This, based on what we saw in those 5 watersheds, it was a pervasive issue in those 5 watersheds. Want to be careful here is that the report does not say that this is a pervasive problem across British Columbia. It was a pervasive issue in at least 3 of those watersheds where it was a high risk to fish and fish habitat, and a moderate in 1 other watershed. But based on what we found there, we suspect, and what we've also identified in other investigations that the board has undertaken, that sediment from roads into streams is a pretty common area of concern from complaints that we receive, or components of special investigations, like our investigation of community watersheds. It is a pretty much a recurring issue that we're seeing.
Thanks very much, Doug. This concludes our available time today. Should you have further questions, please direct them to Doug as the lead investigator on this project. His contact info is on your screen now. You can also engage with us through the social media options shown on screen. In the next few weeks, this webinar will be posted on our website and shared with registrants and others on our distribution list. Thank you for joining us for the Forest Practices Board's question and answer webinar in follow-up to our June 23rd, 2020 presentation of protection of fish habitat under FRPA. Thanks very much.